इस्तीफा नहीं दिया।
To speak up for the disadvantaged makes you, part of a plot to overthrow the government.
Photojournalist Sana Irshad Mattu, who was recently honored with the Pulitzer Prize, was once again stopped at the Delhi airport.
This is a time when authoritarianism is really increasing day by day.
Certainly most people here are really...
I gotta get out of here, okay? So tell me, yes.
Tell her why should we are there.
These hundreds of bodies buried in the sandbank will go down as India's great uncounted COVID dead.
These people, along with Zubair, must be hanged to death for conspiring against India.
Why shouldn't the classroom become a place to learn about others' religions instead of sanitizing them out of the classroom?
This is a country that's gasping for breath. People who can't breathe. Hospitals are having to go to court to beg for oxygen.
We forget that the court documents record that Bilkis Banu was raped 22 times. Bilkis is left asking, should any woman's fight for justice end like this? And the answer to that question depends on us and how much noise we make.
Hello, welcome. I'm Souad Mekhennet, international security correspondent here at the Washington Post, and I am very pleased and honored to have my wonderful colleague here, Barkha Dutt. She's one of the most known journalists in India, and she's also contributing columnist at the Washington Post. Welcome, Barkha.
Thank you very much.
Barkha, we just saw in the introduction video the case of Bilkis Banu, and in the end, you asked the question, should any woman's fight for justice end like this? Could you tell us who is Bilkis Banu, and what does this case show and say about the cases on the lives of women in India and of Muslims in India?
Thank you, Souad, and good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for turning out in such large numbers to hear this conversation. My answer, however, is going to be a little bit complex. Who is Bilkis Banu? Bilkis could be any one of us. She could be any one of us women who has experienced sexual assault of the most horrific, unimaginable kind. She was 19 years old when she was gang raped by a group of 11 men in 2002 in the backdrop of anti-Muslim riots that had taken place in Gujarat. She was pregnant, 3 months pregnant, and she had a 3-year-old baby. As the mob came for her, the baby in her womb obviously didn't survive. Her 3-year-old daughter, Saleha, her head was smashed with a stone. As Bilkis was raped and lay on the ground bleeding, the men then split up and raped her mother. The men made the mother witness the rape of the daughter, and daughter witness the rape of the mother. Bilkis fought. She fought for 17 years, and the Indian justice system actually worked. The men were sentenced to life imprisonment. In India's history, she is the rape survivor to have been granted by the Supreme Court exemplary compensation in 2019. However, now,
the men were released then, right?
Now is the horrific part.
Yeah.
A few months ago, the men who did this to her, who was supposed to spend the rest of their life in prison, were released by a government decision as part of a special program to show leniency to prisoners. And all 11 of them walked out, and they walked out to garlands and sweets. And one of the legislators who was part of the decision to release these men, he said in an interview to my platform that these are men of good values. He referenced their caste, and he said, they're Brahmins, they're men of good values. It made me very angry. I'm not usually an activist journalist. I believe in letting the story speak for itself. This is one of the few stories I've actually run an advocacy campaign on, because I did not see another side.
And do you think they also were released because she was a Muslim woman? Did that play a role in all of this?
So this is where I'm going to give you an answer that's a little bit complex, and I want your understanding, and maybe just 2 minutes to let me explain.
Please go ahead.
Are there issues with religious minorities in India today? Yes. For me, the biggest two issues are the following. We have one of the most powerful elected governments in recent history, completely democratically elected, I should underline. There's nothing about seizing power here or a flawed system. This is what the people of India have willed, and it's an extremely powerful government in terms of how many seats it has. However, the ruling party does not have a single Muslim member in parliament. And to me, that is a problem in a country where there are 220 million Muslims. That's a nation by itself. That is a problem. The other problem is we've seen all manners of literally sort of right-wing nuts, I would call them, make hate speeches that I believe that those in power have not done enough to shut down. However, I want to say something a little complex here. When I travel to the West, there's a broad stroke in the Western media about India. The cliches I usually hear are Muslims under Modi, India in the age of Modi. There's a kind of generalization and no granularity in actually trying to know us. Who are we? We're 1.3 billion people. We're many things all at once. We have issues that we raise our voices against, but we also have extraordinary syncretism. We have diversity, we have pluralism. And just as we talk about Bilkis, one more sentence and I'll shut up. In the last 12 hours, I was up all night before I got to the conference here, came the report of a young woman called Shraddha. She had been killed by her boyfriend. He chopped her up into 35 parts. He minced the intestines. He stored them in the refrigerator in his home, where he then brought other women to date. In this case, the perpetrator was Muslim. The victim was Hindu. I make this point to say two things. We do fight, and we do speak against injustices as we see them. But please try and have a more granular understanding of our nation. And please, as women, let us understand that the fight for women's rights is universal. You've all just been through Roe versus Wade. In many ways, my country is freer on abortion. So let's acknowledge that women are fighting everywhere.
I actually would pick up on this point because you wrote a piece for the Washington Post where you spoke about the prism of prejudice that some Western journalists, when they come to India, that they look at India from a perspective with some prejudices. And I would like to ask you, what exactly do you mean by that? You mentioned a few points, but could you tell us a bit more?
There's an assumption that as an Indian woman, I will by definition be less empowered than many of the women sitting in this hall today. That is the assumption I confronted when I was a student here at grad school at Columbia. I grew up in New York. That was the assumption my schoolmates had. I was a brown girl from India, and somehow I was less of a feminist. Oh, I must be really oppressed. I must only be married by an arranged marriage. They couldn't even imagine that I'm not married, and I'm not.
I grew up with the same prejudice, by the way.
Yeah? The broad stroking and the asymmetry of power, right? Can I come here and look at America only through the prism of race, guns, Roe versus Wade? No, I lived here. I love this country. I recognize that it's many things all at once. I ask for my country to be recognized in the same way.
So, but when you cover cases like Bilkis, or you spoke now about the new case, this actually also does something with you, right? I mean, you have been attacked for some of the coverage you did. Can you tell us what kind of attacks have you faced? What do you have to deal with at the moment covering these things?
Souad, I'm sure you've experienced this. I think any intelligent, independent-minded woman, no matter where in the world, has been intimidated, or there's been an attempt to intimidate us, an attempt to silence us. And nowhere is this more manifest than it is on social media, where you actually have organized, well-oiled machines coming after you, almost like lynch mobs. I call them virtual lynch mobs. And I remember a time when in the context of a story I had reported, where I actually spoke about sort of how criticism does not mean that I'm anti-national. I'm a proud Indian, and if I criticize a policy, let's say, it doesn't make me an anti-national, which is a word that's bandied about far too easily. My phone number was shared on an escort site, on a site for to hire sex workers. And I was then sent about 5,000 dick pics, nude pics, rape threats, threats to shoot me. I got police security briefly, and I was very uncomfortable about it, with it as a reporter, and so I gave it up. And I remembered, funnily enough, I was listening to Hillary Clinton Moderator earlier today, and she'd come to India, and I'd interviewed her. And I was asking her, she was Secretary of State then, and she quoted Eleanor Roosevelt, and she said, Barkha, you have to grow a skin as thick as the hide of a rhinoceros. My challenge is this. I think I have that thick skin, but how do you keep the thick skin but still keep your heart molten? Because we need to be tough outside and soft inside to tell the stories we do.
So what do you do then? How do you keep the thick skin, but how do you also take care of yourself?
I spent 2 years traveling across India reporting on the pandemic in my country at a time when no channels, there were no boots on the ground. I traveled 30,000 kilometers by road from the north to the south of India, spending 130 days consecutively on the road. And I realized that the answer is in returning journalism to people. Everywhere from New Delhi to New York, people have one complaint about the media. They don't see their lives reflected in the news that they consume. And I committed and recommitted to making journalism about people. And I think the answer to those who try and silence us, apart from the thick skin, is to be powerful storytellers and tell a story so good that nobody can afford to ignore you.
I have to ask you this question because you kept talking about the people who try to silence you and organized mobs online. Do you have the impression that any of this is organized by the government to silence you?
No, I would not say that because I have no evidence to actually make that point. But I think I've studied sort of online behavior enough to find that independent-minded people get crushed between ideological camps. I always say we talk about free speech. We just had Salman Rushdie, he's Indian-born, New Yorker, stabbed for his work. Yeah. More than free speech, what we need to re-emphasize, not just in India, but I would say everywhere in the world, is the need for a free, interrogating mind. And as women, we are going to be resented for A, having free, independent minds, for rejecting tribalism, for not being co-opted by any camp, for being ferociously me, individualistic, for speaking truth to power, and for being inconvenient, for being a pain in the ass, for being a troublemaker. I plan to be all of those.
Good for you. Good for you. So what can we do, we as fellow journalists, but also what could international organizations for journalists do to support you to be still the troublemaker and to not give up on all of this despite all the pressure?
I think that we need to be respectful of each other's complexities. Complexity and nuance has become a bad word in the age of polarity. I think we have to acknowledge that as women, we fight everywhere, and sometimes we fight in the space that's supposed to be the safest, our private spaces, in relationships where we think we're going to be safe, and we end up in abusive relationships. In India, I'm fighting to legalize marital rape. It's been a sort of a space I've done a lot of work on. But if we just look at another country from the perch of superiority, we assume ourselves to be culturally superior, democratically superior, superior in some ways of, we have a better track record of civil liberty. What it's going to do is actually diminish the space for these conversations back home, because it's going to get everyone's back up, and people are going to say, hey, dear Americans, do we have a right to also opine about what's happening in your country? And once it's a conversation between equals, that is a much more productive conversation. On journalism, I would only say, Souad, and you are a brilliant, brilliant security correspondent who has covered terror groups. You know this. There is no excuse for bad journalism. We are not activists. That's somebody else's job. We are not politicians. And we are not supplicants to power. We have to be interrogatory, we have to be unafraid, but it has to be through our work. And the lines between news and opinion have blurred to a degree where people have stopped respecting and trusting media. And if we want trust back in media, in India or in the United States of America, actually we need to go back to the basics. We need to be reporters.
Speaking about the basics, how much did your mother play a role in who you became? Your mother was the first war correspondent in India, and she passed away when you were very young. But how did her work influence your life and what you're doing today? If you could give us a short answer.
Yes, thank you for that question. I know the time is up, so I'll keep it short. My mother was the first generation of women journalists in India. When she applied for a job, the editor told her there were no jobs available in the newsroom for women. She was free to cover the flower show in the city. She grew up to be the head of bureau at the Hindustan Times, which is one of India's major newspapers. Few years later, war broke out between India and Pakistan. She asked for a chance to report from the front line. She was told that there was no chance that a woman would be allowed to be a war correspondent. She left with her notepad and pen in the 1960s in a sari to the war front, where she had a cousin in the military, and became, by accident and by will and by stubbornness, India's first woman war correspondent.
There's the stubbornness.
The stubbornness. And 3 decades later, she was already dead. I became a war correspondent at the front line, and I had to really fight as a woman to get to the front line. Our life is a constant battle. Every day is a negotiation. So we should be kind to ourselves, and we should encourage women to be selfish. We've been romanticized for too long as being sacrificing, as being people who put others before ourselves. I want women everywhere to pursue ambition without apology and happiness without regret.
Thank you very much, Barkha. Wonderful. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Thank you so much for being here with us, and please stay here with us. My colleague Francis will be here shortly after the video. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.